Imagine that someone hands you an old book right now at this very moment. A book with a cover cracked by time, yellowed pages, edges darkened as if they had been near flames. Imagine that this book has been forbidden, not in a country, in a century, in a specific culture, but in almost every place in the world for nearly 400 consecutive years. Imagine that priests were expelled from the priesthood for being caught reading it in secret. That rabbis were removed from their communities for mentioning the author's name aloud. That students were expelled from universities for being found with a copy under their mattress. Now imagine that this same book, despite all this persecution, has crossed the centuries. It was copied by hand. It was hidden in secret compartments of libraries. It was secretly translated by sleepless monks. It was read, in silence, by some of the greatest geniuses in history. Einstein always kept it close. Hegel claimed it was impossible to think without first passing through those pages. Nietzsche, upon discovering it as an adult, wrote crying to a friend saying he had finally found a brother of spirit. Borges said those lines were the secret design of the universe. This book exists. It is called Ethics, and it was written by a man who, by putting these ideas on paper, knew perfectly well that he was signing his own sentence. His name was Baruch Spinoza, but perhaps you have never truly heard of him. Perhaps you have heard the name in passing in some philosophy class, in a documentary, in some image caption on the internet. And perhaps you thought, as many do, just another philosopher among so many. No. Spinoza was not just another. Spinoza was the man who, alone, in a small rented room in 17th century Holland, did something that no one before him had done. He looked at God straight in the eye, and he did not lower his gaze. He did not flee to the comfort of official doctrines. He did not hide behind the sacred books he had inherited from his ancestors. He did not back down in the face of threats, excommunications, assassination attempts. And when he opened his mouth to describe what he saw, the whole world turned against him. The Jews expelled him from the synagogue with the most severe curse in their history. The Christians placed his books on the index of forbidden books by the Vatican. The Protestants denounced his ideas as disguised atheism. The absolute monarchs ordered his works to be burned in public squares. And yet, even banished, even cursed, even erased from almost all official records for centuries, what he wrote continued silently to change the world. Why? Why did this lens polisher, this Jew of Portuguese descent, this poor man who refused royal pensions and university chairs to preserve the freedom of his mind, this young man who died at 44 from tuberculosis in a small room in The Hague without family, without wealth, without recognition, why did this man frighten so many people for so long? The answer lies in 7 revelations. 7 ideas he had about God, about angels, about the sacred scriptures, about the prophets, about miracles, about the human soul. 7 ideas that apparently he wrote down with the cold calm of someone demonstrating geometric theorems, without sermons, without offenses, without direct attacks on any religion, just thinking, just reasoning, just following each question to where it led, without averting his gaze. And that was exactly what terrified his contemporaries. Because you can protect yourself against an enemy who shouts, you can respond to an enemy who attacks. But how do you defend yourself against a man who simply thinks, who merely reasons quietly, who simply demonstrates with the serenity of a geometer that what you have always believed may be fundamentally wrong? You can't. The only possible defense is imposed silence, excommunication, the burning of books, the erasure of names, and that is exactly what they tried to do to Spinoza for almost 4 centuries, without success. Because ideas like his are like very small and very powerful seeds. You can try to bury them, you can try to stomp on them, you can try to burn them, and still, somewhere in some crack in the soil, on some rainy night, they sprout, they grow, they become trees, and these trees patiently, with the slow power of their roots, bring down the most solid walls of civilization. I brought you here today to present these 7 seeds to you, not as a historian presenting dry dates and biographies, not as an academic reciting technical terms, but as someone who for many years approached these texts with care, with patience, with the strange and intoxicating feeling of being in the presence of something much greater than my capacity to understand. and who discovered along this path that what Spinoza said is not just philosophy, it is not just theology, it is not just metaphysics, it is a different way of breathing, a different way of looking at the sky, a different way of aging, a different way of living. The first of these 7 revelations may be the simplest to state and the hardest to accept. You will hear it in a few minutes, and you may want to recoil immediately because it touches on the oldest and deepest thing in the human imagination, the idea of where God is and who God is. The second will take you inside the minds of the prophets, those men who claim to have heard the voice of God, and it will show you, with disconcerting clarity, what Spinoza believed was really happening in those minds. The third will talk about angels, and here I need to warn you sincerely. What he wrote about angels is so direct, so devastating, so impossible to refute with common arguments, that many of the first editors of his work simply cut those passages from his books, pretending they were never written. You will hear those passages uncut. The fourth will deal with what we call miracles. The fifth with the notion of sin. The sixth with what we feel when someone we love dies. And the seventh, the last, the highest of all, will offer you something that few texts in the world can offer. A way of relating to the sacred that dispenses with temples, that dispenses with intermediaries, that dispenses with fear. A direct relationship, a serene relationship, a relationship that Spinoza called, in Latin, intellectual love of God, and which may be the noblest form of spirituality that a human being can achieve. But to get there, we will need to walk together for a few hours. No rush, no shortcuts, no hasty cynicism that often hovers over modern conversations about faith and reason. We will need to return to Amsterdam on a July morning in 1656. We will need to enter that synagogue with black curtains, hear the words of the curse. We will need to follow Spinoza as he walks alone through the narrow streets of the city, with his coat torn by the knife of an assailant who tried to kill him at the temple's exit. We will need to sit with him in his small room by the light of a single candle as he writes, page after page, what would forever change the way the West thought about God. When this walk ends, and when the last of the 7 revelations has dissolved in your mind, like a drop of ink in a glass of water, you will not leave here the same. I am not promising that you will agree with Spinoza. I am not promising that you will abandon your faith. I am not promising that you will become a philosopher. I am only promising one thing, and this I can guarantee, because it is what always happens to those who approach these texts with an open heart. You will feel in the end that something inside you has silenced, and that this silence is perhaps the purest form of prayer that exists. The first revelation is about to begin, and it begins, like all great ideas begin, with a simple question. So simple that it seems naive, so naive that it seems childish, and yet so powerful that everything else unfolds from it. The question is this: if God is infinite, as we have been taught, then where exactly does God end and the rest begin? This question crossed Spinoza's mind on some ordinary night in Amsterdam, and when he tried to answer it, with all the honesty of his reason, he discovered something that could no longer be undone. Let's discover it together. It was a cold autumn night in Amsterdam. The year was 1655, a few months before the great excommunication that would change his life forever. The city slept under a thick fog that rose from the canals and covered the narrow streets like a grey cloak. The oil lanterns swayed in the wind, casting crooked shadows on the dark brick walls, and in a small room in the Jewish quarter, illuminated only by a half-melted candle, a young man with a dark beard and deep eyes was writing something that, if discovered, would cost him much more than his reputation. Baruch Spinoza was 23 years old. His hand trembled, but not from fear. It trembled with intellectual excitement. Before him, on the worn wooden table, lay open 3 books: the Torah in Hebrew, the writings of Descartes in Latin, and a small notebook where he noted, with the patient precision of a watchmaker, the contradictions he perceived between what men read and what they thought. And it was on that night, or on a night very much like it, that Spinoza arrived at the first of his 7 great revelations, an idea so simple in its formulation and so devastating in its consequences that it would forever change the history of Western thought. The idea was this: God is not somewhere. God is everywhere. More than that, God is the very place. You need to understand the weight of this, because at first glance it seems just a beautiful phrase, one of those heard in spiritual retreats or vaguely mystical lectures. But Spinoza was not a mystic, he was a geometer, a man who thought with the calm coldness of Euclid and the silent precision of a surgeon. When he said that God was all things, he was not being poetic. He was being, in his opinion, brutally logical. Think with me without haste. If God is infinite, as the three great monotheistic religions unanimously affirm, then, by definition, there can be absolutely nothing outside of God. Because if there were something outside of God, that something would be a limit. And that which has limits, by definition, is not infinite. Therefore, either God is not infinite, or everything that exists is in some way within God, is part of God, is God. Spinoza chose the second option, and by choosing it, he demolished, in a single logical blow, the oldest and most comforting image of humanity, the image that God is a being separate from us, a Lord sitting on a throne up there, observing the universe from the outside, like a judge observes defendants in a court. No. For Spinoza, God is not looking at the universe. God is the universe, and more than that, God is the universe and all its laws and all its stars and all its ants and all its oceans and all its thoughts and all its silences and all its possible forms of existence. When you look at the starry sky on a clear night, you are not looking at the work of God. You are looking directly at God. When you feel the wind on your face on a winter afternoon, it is not God who sends the wind, as if there were a God on one side and a wind on the other. The wind, in its deepest essence, is one of the infinite ways in which God manifests. When you hear a child laugh, when you see a flower slowly open to the morning sun, when you feel your heart tighten at a farewell at the airport, it is not God behind these things, hidden somewhere. These things, in their most essential aspect, are God manifesting. The phrase Spinoza used to describe this is perhaps the most dangerous phrase in all his philosophy. In Latin he wrote, Deus sive natura, God, or rather, nature. The two are the same thing, not two names for different things, not two faces of the same coin, but one reality, one substance, viewed from different angles by our limited mind. When this phrase reached the ears of the rabbis of Amsterdam, they immediately understood what was at stake. Because if God is nature, then there is no longer a temple separate from the world. There is no longer a special covenant between God and a chosen people. There is no longer a sacred distance between heaven and earth. There is no longer a law given at Sinai by a voice coming from outside the clouds. There is no longer Moses talking to a burning bush in the desert, as if God were a character who appears at certain moments and disappears at others. All of this, in Spinoza's view, were metaphors, human images, forms that primitive men found to try to describe, with the only language they had, a reality infinitely greater than any human mind could encompass. And when this same phrase reached the ears of Christian theologians, the horror was even greater. Because if God is nature, then Christ is not the only Son of a Heavenly Father separate from the world. The crucifixion was not a cosmic sacrifice to appease the wrath of a distant God. Original sin was not a stain inherited from Adam and passed on to his descendants. All of this crumbled like a house of cards before a single idea, that the sacred is not somewhere separate from us, but is the very fabric of what exists. But perhaps, at this moment, you are thinking exactly what Spinoza's contemporaries thought when they first heard these ideas. You must be thinking, so Spinoza was an atheist. Was he denying God? And that is precisely the question that destroyed his life. Because the religious of his time accused him of atheism, saying that he had killed God by confusing him with nature. And the atheists, centuries later, accused him of being too religious, saying that he merely swapped God's name for another disguise. Spinoza was caught in the middle, alone, misunderstood, a man between two worlds, refusing to belong to either. The truth is that Spinoza believed in God more than most priests of his time. But it was a God so immense, so impersonal, so infinitely above any human notion of father, judge, or king, that for ordinary religious people it was impossible to recognize him. The God of Spinoza did not have a white beard. He had no wrath. He had no jealousy. He had no favorites. The God of Spinoza did not reward the good or punish the bad in a celestial bookkeeping. He did not answer prayers in the sense we usually imagine. He did not perform miracles by breaking the laws of nature, because the laws of nature were themselves the direct expression of his eternal being. For Spinoza, wanting God to change the laws of nature to help you is like wanting a circle to stop having 360 degrees to do you a favor. It is not that God refuses, it is that this is a contradiction in itself. The laws by which the universe moves are not external impositions that God has established over inert matter. They are the very way God exists. Changing those laws would be God ceasing to be God. And here is the point that most disturbed Spinoza's contemporaries, and that may disturb you now sitting there hearing this story. If this is true, then the relationship we have with the sacred needs to be radically rethought. It is no longer about begging, bargaining, offering sacrifices to gain favors. It is about understanding, about looking at reality as it is, with the greatest depth possible, and realizing that within it, in every atom, in every wave, in every thought, in every beat of your heart right now, there is a direct manifestation of the divine. Spinoza called this type of knowledge intellectual love of God. It was the highest form of spirituality he conceived. It was not kneeling in a temple. It was not reciting memorized prayers. It was not listening to sermons. It was thinking. It was looking deeply at the universe and realizing that it and you are not separate. It was feeling with all the cold clarity of reason that you are a wave in an infinite ocean and that this ocean is God. There is something disturbingly beautiful about this idea, and there is also something terrifying. Because if Spinoza is right, then everything that happens, absolutely everything, is a manifestation of God. The stars that are born and die, the wars, the births, the plagues, the love songs, the laughter of children, the agonies of the dying, everything, without exception. And this means that evil, in the cosmic sense we usually think of, may not exist in the way we have been told. It may just be our limited view of something much greater, which from the perspective of eternity, from the perspective of God, is part of a harmony that our finite mind cannot grasp. It was this first revelation that opened the doors to all the others. It was from this cornerstone that God is all that exists and that all that exists is God, that Spinoza began to patiently dismantle, century after century, all the religious images that humanity had built around the sacred, the prophets, the angels, the demons, heaven, hell, miracles. One by one, he would subject them to the same ruthless analysis, and one by one, they would reveal themselves to be something very different from what we have always been told. But for him to take the next step, he needed to confront one of the most sacred and untouchable figures in the Western religious tradition, a figure so central that denying it was, in the eyes of his contemporaries, equivalent to denying the very possibility of divine revelation. This figure was Moses. And what Spinoza discovered about the prophet who spoke with God on the mountain was perhaps even more explosive than everything he had thought up to that moment. There is a scene that, for most of humanity, is practically untouchable. A scene so ancient, so repeated, so deeply engraved in the collective memory of the West, that even those who do not belong to any religion know every detail of it. A man climbs a mountain. The sky fills with lightning, the clouds part. A huge voice, coming from somewhere above the clouds, begins to speak. And the man, trembling, kneeling, receives directly into his hands the tablets with the commandments that would guide humanity for the next 3,000 years. Moses, Sinai, the tablets, the voice of God. This scene is so central to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that denying it is, in practice, equivalent to removing the cornerstone of the Western religious edifice. Remove this scene, and the rest begins to crumble. Because if Moses did not speak directly with God, then where exactly did the 10 Commandments come from? If the voice did not come from outside, from the clouds, from the top of the mountain, where did it come from? And if these laws were not dictated by God in person, why have we been following them for over 3 millennia? It was precisely this question that on some silent night in Amsterdam crossed Baruch Spinoza's mind. And he, unlike almost all other thinkers before him, did not back down before it. Spinoza began to study the scriptures with an analytical coldness that no rabbi, no priest, no imam of his time had dared to apply before. He did not read the Bible as a sacred and untouchable book. He read it as a historical document, as a set of texts written by men, in certain languages, at certain times, in certain cultures. And what he found when reading this way was something that still deeply disturbs theologians today. First detail, the Torah states at various points that it was written by Moses. But the Torah itself describes in rich detail the death of Moses. It describes his burial. It describes the 30 days of mourning of the community. It describes events that happened centuries after his death. How can a man write about his own burial? How can a man narrate events that occurred 300 years after his death? Spinoza, with the cold patience of a detective, listed these inconsistencies, one by one, in his theological political treatise. There were so many, so evident, so impossible to ignore, that he arrived at a simple and devastating conclusion. The books we attribute to Moses were not written by Moses. They were written by other people, in other times, based on oral traditions passed down from generation to generation, and finally compiled by some ancient editor, centuries after the events they describe. This simple observation, now peacefully accepted by almost all serious scholars of the Bible, was in the 17th century a heresy capable of leading a man to the stake. Spinoza was the first to put it on paper with the clarity of a geometer, and he paid dearly for it. But this was just the anteroom to his second great revelation. The deeper, more disturbing, more philosophically explosive part was yet to come, because Spinoza was not only interested in discussing who wrote what, he wanted to go deeper. He wanted to understand the phenomenon of prophecy itself. What exactly happened in the minds of those men called prophets? Did they really hear a voice from outside? Did they really receive messages transmitted by God in person? Or was something quite different happening inside their heads than tradition has told us? And the answer he formulated, after years of study, is perhaps one of the boldest ideas in all of Western philosophy. Spinoza wrote with that characteristic calm of his, more or less the following: the prophets were not men who heard God in a way different from the rest of humanity. They were men endowed with a particularly vivid imagination, particularly intense, particularly capable of producing internal images with such force that these images became, for them, absolutely real. They did not receive messages from outside. They generated these messages within themselves, from a rare combination of moral sensitivity, historical suffering of their people, and an extraordinary imaginative capacity. Pause for a moment and think about the weight of this. Spinoza was not saying that the prophets were liars. He was not saying they were charlatans. He was not saying they invented their visions to deceive the people. On the contrary, Spinoza believed that the prophets were, in general, sincere men, men who truly believed they were hearing a divine voice. Spinoza's point was different and more subtle. He was saying that what the prophets felt as the voice of God coming from outside was, in fact, the voice of their own imagination, an imagination so powerful, so morally charged, so intertwined with the pains and hopes of their people, that it manifested in their consciousness as if it were an external intervention. And Moses, according to Spinoza, was the most extreme case of this phenomenon. A man who, upon climbing Sinai, in a state of prolonged fasting, under the emotional impact of having liberated an entire people from slavery, amid a storm of lightning and thunder that surely occurred at the top of that mountain, had one of the most intense inner experiences a human being has ever had. And this experience, for him, was indistinguishable from a voice coming from outside. Here arises an inevitable question. If that is the case, then are the 10 Commandments not divine? Did they not come from God? Are they merely a human invention? And here Spinoza gives an answer that often surprises those who read him for the first time. No, he said, the 10 Commandments are indeed divine, but not in the sense you imagine. They are not divine because they were dictated by a voice coming from the clouds. They are divine because they express, in a simple form, adapted to the understanding of ordinary people, profound rational principles about how to live well. about how to build a society that does not devour itself, about how to respect life, property, truth, parents, and one's spouse. These principles, according to Spinoza, can be discovered by reason. They do not need a burning mountain to be revealed. But for a people newly freed from slavery, steeped in ignorance, fear, and ancient superstitions, these principles needed to be presented dramatically, with storms and stone tablets, so that they could be absorbed. Moses' imagination served as a bridge between pure rationality and the limited understanding of his people. In other words, Spinoza was saying something extremely delicate. The prophets were translators of a profound rational reality into the language of popular imagination. But, in translating, they themselves did not know this. They believed they were transmitting divine words, when in fact they were expressing in dramatic images principles that could also be reached by the serene reason of a philosopher. Imagine the impact of this idea in the 17th century. Imagine the reaction of the rabbis reading that Moses had not in fact spoken with God. Imagine the reaction of Christian theologians reading that the entire prophetic tradition was, in essence, a phenomenon of human imagination. Imagine the reaction of Muslims realizing that this same analysis applied to the prophets of the Quran, including Muhammad himself. There it was, in a few pages written with almost arithmetic calm, the explosive enough to shake 3,000 years of religious tradition. And yet, Spinoza was not demolishing religion. He was, in his opinion, saving what was deepest in it. He was separating the shell from the seed. The shell was the dramatic imagination of the prophets, the storms, the angels, the voices, the fires. All of this, for Spinoza, was the shell. Useful for certain times, certain cultures, certain pedagogical needs, but a shell nonetheless. The seed, on the other hand, was the rational, ethical, profound content of the messages those prophets transmitted. Love your neighbor. Do not kill. Do not steal. Do not lie. Cultivate justice. Care for orphans and widows. Treat the stranger with dignity. These, for Spinoza, were the truly divine teachings. And divine, let it be repeated, not because they came from a voice up there, but because they expressed in simple words the deepest rational structure of the universe, which is God manifesting itself. There is a phrase from Spinoza, written in the treatise, that perhaps summarizes all this. He said that the true word of God was not written in any book. The true word of God was written in the heart of every man capable of reasoning sincerely and loving deeply. The sacred books were, for him, imperfect echoes of that inner word. Useful echoes, beautiful echoes, important echoes, but echoes, not the thing itself. This second revelation was perhaps the one that caused the most uproar among the religious of the time, because while the first about God being nature could be interpreted as an abstract metaphysical speculation distant from everyday life, this second one directly touched the scriptures. It directly touched Moses. It directly touched what every child learned from the earliest years of catechesis. It was saying, in essence, that everything that was told about prophets talking with God on high mountains was, at best, a spiritual truth wrapped in dramatic images, and at worst a sincere misunderstanding of human imagination. And when this idea fell into the hands of his contemporaries, it was received exactly as you can imagine, with shouts, with excommunications, with prohibitions, with books burned in public squares. But also in silence it crossed the centuries, influencing the great critical scholars of the Bible who would appear centuries later. Today, any serious scholar of the biblical text accepts, without any embarrassment, many of the observations that Spinoza was the first to make. But in his time, it was enough to make him be treated as one of the most dangerous figures in Europe. Now, following along with me so far, you may be feeling a certain discomfort, and that is natural. Because this second revelation, more than the first, directly touches on something you may have always accepted as an absolute truth, the idea that there are men chosen by God to convey messages to humanity. Spinoza was not saying that these men did not exist. He was saying that what happened in their heads was different from what has always been painted. And here, before we move on, I need to invite you to take an inner pause, because many people, upon reaching this point in Spinoza, simply close the book. They say, "Enough, this is too much." They refuse to continue, and it is a comprehensible reaction. Touching on Moses is touching on something very ancient within us. But if you have the patience to continue with me, you will discover that Spinoza was not destroying faith. He was merely separating faith from superstition, and this separation in the end, instead of impoverishing the sacred, makes it deeper, quieter, more immense. Because the next revelation, the third, will touch on something even more delicate. On those luminous figures that appear in the margins of biblical stories, whispering messages, opening paths, fighting invisible wars in the heavens, the angels. And what Spinoza said about them, in a few lines written in a private letter to a Dutch friend, is perhaps the most censored, most hidden, most carefully erased passage of all his work for almost 400 years. You are about to hear these lines uncut, but to fully understand them, we first need to pause for a moment, breathe, let this second revelation settle. Because the next door once opened will not close again. I know that many of you who have been following me so far have experienced that strange moment when an idea enters your mind and simply won't leave. That idea that comes back in the shower, on the way to work, at bedtime. Spinoza's ideas are exactly of this kind. They settle in silently and begin, slowly, to reorganize everything around them. So, I want to make a sincere request to you now. If up to this point in our conversation something inside you has shifted, if something has ignited, if at any moment you needed to stop and take a deep breath, leave a comment below telling me. It doesn't have to be a long text. It can be a word, a sentence. It can simply be, "I'm here, listening." It can be a question that lingered in your mind. It can be a doubt. It can be a respectful disagreement. Because Spinoza, more than any philosopher, appreciated thinking that disagrees peacefully. And if you felt at any moment during this journey that it was worth coming this far, consider doing something simple, but that makes all the difference for a channel like this. Subscribe, activate the bell, because we are building slowly in silence, far from the world's rush, a small space for deep thought, a place where figures like Spinoza, Heraclitus, Marcus Aurelius, Hannah Arendt, Simone Weil can be discussed calmly, without all the noise of today's internet. And by subscribing, you are becoming part of this silent circle of seekers, those who believe that thinking slowly is an act of resistance in this hurried world. Stay with me, because the next revelation is perhaps the most surprising of all, and it begins with a question that no one before Spinoza had the courage to ask out loud. There is a letter, an old letter written in Dutch at some point between the years 1662 and 1663, addressed to a man named Hugo Boxel. This Boxel was an intellectual friend of Spinoza, a cultured man trained in law who lived in Gorinchem and maintained a long and fascinating correspondence with the philosopher. And at a certain point in their exchange of letters, Boxel asked Spinoza a seemingly simple question, but one that touched on one of the most sensitive points of any religious tradition. Boxel wanted to know Spinoza's opinion on ghosts, on spirits, on apparitions, and amidst all this, about angels. Spinoza could have answered vaguely. He could have sidestepped the issue. He could have given a diplomatic answer that wouldn't compromise anyone. It was the most sensible strategy, especially for a man who had already been excommunicated, persecuted, watched, and whose books were already being discussed in theological circles with increasing hostility. But Spinoza, true to his nature, responded with that disconcerting honesty that was his hallmark. And what he wrote about angels in that letter was so direct, so logical, so impossible to refute with common theological arguments, that for almost 3 centuries the editors of his works simply cut those passages. They made incomplete additions. They said those letters had been lost. They published only selected excerpts, omitting precisely the parts where Spinoza spoke about the winged beings that fill the scriptures. Why so much fear of a few lines written in a private letter? Because Spinoza, in those lines, did something that no one before him had dared to do. He applied the same ruthless analysis to angels that he had applied to prophets, and the result, once understood, was impossible to undo. The argument was more or less as follows. Let's follow the reasoning calmly, because it is a reasoning that needs to be unfolded slowly to feel all its strength. First, Spinoza said, let's consider what angels would be, according to tradition. Tradition presents them as spiritual beings, created by God, endowed with their own intelligence and will, who serve as messengers between heaven and earth. They would not have a physical body, in the strict sense of the word, but could appear to men in human form when necessary. They would be immortal. They would be in some intermediate place between God and human beings, closer to God, but still distinct from Him. Well then, if angels have no body, Spinoza said, then what exactly are they? Here the argument begins to become dense. Follow along with me. Spinoza had demonstrated in his Ethics that everything that exists necessarily belongs to one of the two forms by which we know the unique substance, that is, God or nature. It either belongs to what he calls extension, which is the domain of bodies, of matter, of things that occupy space, or it belongs to what he calls thought, which is the domain of ideas, of minds, of acts of consciousness. There is no third category. Everything that exists is either body or idea or both at the same time, seen from different angles by our perception. Now, angels, according to tradition, would not have a body. Therefore, they do not belong to the domain of extension. That leaves the domain of thought. But if angels are only thought, then they would be merely ideas. And ideas, Spinoza said, are not autonomous entities that wander around delivering messages. Ideas are modes of the attribute of thought, always linked to a mind that thinks them. There is no idea without a mind to sustain it. There is no thought floating in a vacuum, independent of any being that thinks. So Spinoza asked, in which mind exactly do these angels exist as pure thought? In the mind of God. But if that were the case, they would simply be divine thoughts, modes of God's infinite understanding, and not separate creatures with their own will, in the minds of the men who see them. But in that case, they would be phenomena of human imagination, not real beings with independent existence. In any hypothesis, Spinoza said with that cold calm that characterized his reasoning, angels cannot be what tradition says they are. They cannot be incorporeal beings flying through the universe delivering messages, because purely incorporeal beings in his philosophy are merely ideas, and ideas need minds to sustain them. And here Spinoza took the boldest step in his analysis. He said more or less the following. When we read in the scriptures that an angel appeared to Abraham, that an angel wrestled with Jacob by the river Jabbok, that an angel appeared to Mary announcing the birth of Jesus, that an angel guided Peter out of prison, what was happening, in fact, was a phenomenon of human imagination very similar to what occurred with the prophets. The men and women who described these experiences were not lying. They were reporting with all sincerity what they saw within themselves. But what they saw within themselves was a production of their own imagination, intense and vivid enough to be felt as an external presence. Angels, according to Spinoza, were, above all, modes by which human imagination translated into comprehensible images what it perceived as a message from the universe, as moral intuition, as a sudden spiritual impulse. When an ancient man, sitting in silence on a starry night, suddenly felt a deep certainty about what he should do with his life, he had two options to describe that experience. One option was to say, I thought a lot about this, and I came to this conclusion. The other option, more natural for a mind steeped in the religious culture of his time, was to say, an angel appeared to me and told me what to do. Both descriptions, Spinoza said, can refer to the same inner phenomenon. But the second description, although dramatic and beautiful, transforms a mental process into an independent being that supposedly lives in some separate realm. Can you feel, at this moment, why these paragraphs were cut for centuries? Because they dismantle with cold logic all the angelic iconography that fills European cathedrals, all those paintings of Gabriel descending from the heavens with white wings and golden robes, all those frescoes of celestial armies battling demons in cosmic battles, all those statues of chubby cherubs pointing to the sky in Baroque churches, all of this, according to Spinoza, was the visual representation of something that never existed in the way it was painted. Not that the artists were lying. They were representing, with the resources of their art, what the collective imagination of humanity had created over the centuries. But the representation did not correspond to an external reality. It corresponded to an internal phenomenon, projected outward. But Spinoza, true to his extraordinary intellectual honesty, did not stop there. He did something that many later critics failed to notice. He added in the same letter to Boxall an important observation. He said that he was speaking based on his own reasoning, and that he was open to hearing contrary arguments. He said that if Boxall had any solid evidence, any logical demonstration, any consistent reason to believe in the existence of angels as real and independent beings, he would be willing to consider it seriously. But that, until that moment, he had found in the scriptures, neither in tradition nor in reason, any argument that convinced him that angels existed in any way other than the way he described. Boxall replied. He argued. He brought examples from tradition. He cited biblical passages. He spoke of accounts of apparitions. And Spinoza, with geometric patience, dismantled each argument, one by one, showing that each example could be explained within the framework he had drawn, that each apparition could be interpreted as a phenomenon of imagination, that each angelic message could be understood as a particularly vivid moral intuition, that each celestial battle could be read as a metaphor for internal spiritual conflicts, and the most disturbing detail of this entire correspondence is that, despite all of Spinoza's logic, Boxall could not convince himself. He argued, returned with new examples, resorted to ancient authorities. And Spinoza, at a certain point in the exchange, wrote a sentence that may be one of the most revealing in all his work. He said, more or less, that the reason Boxall could not abandon his belief in angels was not a matter of evidence or argument. It was an emotional issue. It was the comfort that this belief brought him. It was the dramatic beauty of the ancient stories. It was the feeling that the universe without angels would be colder, emptier, more terrifying. And Spinoza then made a delicate observation. He said he understood this discomfort. He understood perfectly, but that the philosopher's task was not to avoid discomfort. It was to follow the truth wherever it led, even when it led to places less comfortable than the fairy tales about winged beings. Here, perhaps, it is worth pausing to think about something that many people lose sight of when they read Spinoza for the first time. He was not saying that the sacred does not exist. He was not saying that the universe is cold, mechanical, empty. On the contrary, Spinoza's entire philosophy is a passionate celebration of reality, seen as a direct manifestation of the divine. His point about angels was simply this. The presence of God in the universe is so immense, so direct, so absolute, that it does not need intermediaries. It does not need winged beings flying back and forth delivering messages. God is in every falling leaf, in every wave of the sea, in every thought that crosses your mind at this moment. Imagining that God needs to send messengers to communicate with us is, in Spinoza's view, to diminish the immensity of God. It is to reduce him to a distant figure who can only approach the world through celestial employees. The direct presence of God, without intermediaries, without angelic hierarchies, without celestial choirs, was for Spinoza far grander than any angelic mythology. It was, in his words, the silent immensity of the universe manifesting in every point, at the same time, without needing messengers, because the message is existence itself. And here we come to a delicate point that needs to be said with care. You who are following this journey may have lived profound experiences involving what you have always called angelic presence. You may have, in difficult moments of life, felt a protection, a guide, an invisible presence by your side. Spinoza was not saying that these experiences did not happen. He was not saying that you imagined them. He was not saying that they were illusions. He was saying something more subtle. He was saying that what you felt as angelic presence was, in fact, a direct manifestation of the divine within you. Not a separate angel from you, coming from some distant place, but the very infinite presence of God, which is also your own deepest essence, manifesting at that moment with particular clarity. The difference is not small. The first interpretation places God far away, and the angel as a bridge. The second eliminates the bridge because it eliminates the distance. You have never been separate from the divine. What you felt as an angel was the divine recognizing itself within you. There is a depth to this that few religious texts have managed to reach. It is not colder. It is warmer. It is not more distant. It is infinitely closer. It is not a reduction of the sacred. It is its total amplification. And that is why these lines, these few pages that Spinoza wrote about angels in private letters, were so systematically erased for almost 4 centuries, because they, by removing intermediaries, also removed the power structure that depended on those intermediaries. Churches that sell angelic protection, temples that sell celestial mediation, priests who sell access to divine messengers. All of this lost its meaning if God were, as Spinoza said, present directly at every point in the universe, without the need for intermediary employees. This was the third revelation, perhaps the most uncomfortable of the 3, because it disturbs one of the most beautiful and oldest images of human imagination. The image of winged beings descending from the heavens to help us. Spinoza was not destroying this image. He was transforming it. He was saying that what this image represents in its deepest truth is not an army of flying creatures. It is the direct presence of the divine in all things, manifesting with particular intensity at certain moments of human life. And this transformation, once understood, opens the doors to the 4th revelation, a revelation that touches on something even more delicate, something that is at the heart of all religions, something that has separated for centuries believers from non-believers, the faithful from the skeptics, the religious from the materialists, miracles. And what Spinoza said about miracles in the theological political treatise is perhaps the most carefully argued part of all his work, a part in which he not only criticizes but builds, not only dismantles but offers, in place of the old ideas, a new way of understanding what really happens in those moments when life seems to bend before our expectations. But this 4th door requires, before being opened, a deep breath, because it will touch on everything you have ever called, at some point in your life, a miracle. Perhaps you have already lived one. Perhaps you know someone who has lived one. Perhaps you have read about one, in old newspapers or in sacred books that have crossed millennia. That moment when life, against all odds, against all apparent laws of nature, against everything that seemed to be the natural course of things, simply bends. A medical diagnosis that dissolves without explanation. A child who escapes from an accident in which no one should have survived. A rain that falls exactly when the harvest was about to be lost. A word spoken by someone at a moment when it seemed that life had ended. Miracles occupy in human imagination a place that goes far beyond the walls of churches. They are perhaps the most concrete way in which people feel the presence of God. When someone says they lived a miracle, they are saying that they felt at that moment that the divine had touched their life directly, that something from outside the world had entered the world, that an invisible hand had reached out to alter the course of things. And it was precisely this point that Spinoza, with his cold courage and geometric logic, decided to confront head-on, because for him, this popular notion of miracle, while extremely comforting, was also extremely dangerous. Not because it diminishes God, as many think, but on the contrary, because in Spinoza's view, this common notion of miracle diminishes God in a way that is almost imperceptible, and for that reason even deeper. Follow along with me in the reasoning. No rush. Spinoza begins by asking what exactly people mean when they talk about miracles, and the answer in Western religious traditions tends to be more or less this. A miracle is an event that violates natural laws. It is a moment when God intervenes in the world, temporarily suspending the rules by which the universe operates, to produce an effect that would not otherwise happen. The crossing of the Red Sea, the multiplication of loaves, the resurrection of Lazarus, the instantaneous healing of a sick person. In all these cases, according to traditional interpretation, God breaks the natural order to produce something extraordinary. And here, Spinoza said, lies a huge problem, almost invisible, but huge. If God needs to break the laws of nature to produce a miracle, this implicitly means 2 things. First, that the laws of nature are something separate from God, something that exists apart from Him, and that He needs to break when He wants to act. Second, that God is normally not acting in the world, that He is, so to speak, absent, and that only in special moments does he decide to intervene. For Spinoza, these two implications were absurd, because he had demonstrated in his philosophy that God and nature are the same reality seen from different angles. The laws of nature are not something external to God. They are the very way God exists and manifests. Asking God to break the laws of nature is asking God to cease being God. It is like asking a triangle to stop having three sides. It is not a matter of power. It is a matter of essence. And moreover, Spinoza said, the idea that God normally does not act in the world and only acts in special moments is a huge diminishment of divine greatness. For Spinoza's philosophy, God is acting all the time, in every atom, in every instant, in every movement of the stars, and in every beat of your heart right now. There is not a single moment when God is absent. There is not a single event that is not, in its deepest essence, a direct manifestation of the divine being. In this framework, the idea of a miracle as an exceptional intervention completely loses its meaning, because everything, without exception, is already divine. Imagine a fish that spends its entire life in the sea. This fish never thinks of water as something extraordinary. Water is its normal environment, the common medium, what is always there. But if suddenly this fish could imagine the possibility that, at some special moment, a little water would appear around it, it would consider that a miracle. Spinoza said that we, in relation to God, are like that fish. We live immersed in God all the time. Every breath we take is God. Every thought is God. Every particle of the universe around us is God. And yet we live imagining that God only appears from time to time, in special moments, in specific miracles. But Spinoza did not stop there. He went further. He went to the point where this idea becomes truly disturbing. He said that the popular notion of miracle, far from bringing people closer to God, actually distances them. Because this notion, by concentrating the divine presence in exceptional events, drains the sacred from everything that happens in the rest of life. If God is only in miracles, then where is God when you have breakfast? Where is God when you walk to work? Where is God when you sleep next to the one you love? Where is God when a child learns to read, when a flower blooms, when a wave breaks on the sand? For most people, the automatic answer to these questions is a kind of whisper. God is there, of course, but in a less intense, less visible, less important way. Miracles would be the high moments. The rest would be the common everyday. And it is precisely this hierarchy, this division of the world into special sacred moments and banal common moments, that Spinoza considered the deepest error of religious imagination. For him, true spirituality begins the very instant this hierarchy collapses. The moment you understand, with total depth, that the everyday is not the opposite of the sacred. The everyday is the sacred. The cup of coffee you drink in the morning is as divine as the multiplication of loaves. The breath of the child sleeping in the next room is as miraculous as any angelic apparition. The raw fact that there is something, instead of nothing, is the permanent miracle that most people, being so accustomed to it, fail to perceive. Spinoza expressed this idea in a way that still resonates strongly today. He said more or less that whoever truly understands nature does not need miracles to believe in God, because for those who understand nature, the entire nature is already the permanent miracle. The falling of leaves in autumn, the growth of a child, the way planets move around the sun, the inexplicable emergence of consciousness from matter, the beauty we feel before a sunset, the love we feel for someone we barely know. All of this is so extraordinary, so impossible to fully explain, so luminous when looked at with attention, that asking for additional miracles is like asking for more light from the sun. But then, someone might ask Spinoza, what about the miracles described in the scriptures? What about the crossing of the Red Sea? What about the resurrection of Lazarus? What about the healing of the blind? Spinoza had an answer for this, and this answer requires care to be understood. He said first, that many of the so-called miracles described in the scriptures can be explained by natural causes that the ancients in their time did not understand. A strong wind that pushes the waters at a decisive moment may have seemed like a miracle to those who did not know the seasonal winds of that region. A spontaneous healing, possible under certain conditions, may have seemed supernatural to those who did not know medicine. There was no intervention there that broke the laws of nature. There were rather rare natural events occurring in psychologically charged moments, and therefore felt as a direct manifestation of the divine. But more important than this naturalistic explanation was Spinoza's second argument. He said that even if some of these miracles had happened exactly as described, they still would not prove God. Because a miracle, to be identified as a miracle, depends on our already having a notion of what the normal course of nature is, and this notion, ultimately, is a construction of our reason. But reason, for Spinoza, is the most direct path to God. Not miracles, not exceptions. The rule, the order, the law. In other words, Spinoza was inverting traditional religious logic. Traditionally it was said, look at the miracles, they prove that God exists. Spinoza said, look at the unbreakable order of nature. It is the direct manifestation of God. Miracles, if they existed as ruptures of order, would ironically be arguments against God, not in favor. Because a God who needs to break his own laws to manifest is an inferior God to a God whose very essence is those laws. There is a phrase attributed to Einstein that perhaps summarizes the spirit of this fourth revelation. Einstein, who deeply admired Spinoza, said that there are two ways to live. One is to live as if nothing is a miracle. The other is to live as if everything is a miracle. Spinoza was, integrally, of the second school. For him, there were no isolated special events amidst a banal world. There was a permanent, continuous, sustained miracle, which is the very fact of there being a universe, and within this permanent miracle, every event, from the most ordinary to the most extraordinary, was a face of it. Think for a moment about what this changes in your practical life. If Spinoza is right, then there is no reason to wait for special moments to feel God. There is no reason to seek God only in temples, in pilgrimages, in specific rituals. God is there now at the very moment you hear these words. He is in the subtle movement of your lungs as you breathe. He is in the light that illuminates the environment you are in. He is in the millions of chemical processes happening inside your body as you simply exist. He is in the consciousness that, at this moment, is following this philosophical journey. This perception, when it truly settles in, transforms a person's relationship with everyday life. The small things begin to shine. A glass of water ceases to be just a glass of water. A conversation with a friend ceases to be just a conversation. A gesture of affection ceases to be just a gesture. Everything begins to be seen, felt, lived as a direct manifestation of the same divine that the ancients sought in celestial fires and voices from the clouds. And here, perhaps, lies the greatest irony of the entire fourth revelation. Spinoza, by demolishing the popular notion of miracle, does not actually drain the world of the sacred. He floods the world with the sacred. Because, in his view, there is not a single point in the universe, not a single moment in time in which the divine is absent, and this total omnipresence, this immensity that leaves no corner empty, is the true miracle. A miracle so immense, so constant, so sustained, that most people, being immersed in it, fail to perceive it. Spinoza was not denying the sacred. He was merely saying that the sacred is greater than any limited notion we have of it, and that reducing the sacred to isolated moments of divine intervention is like reducing the ocean to a few chosen drops. The ocean is not in a few drops. The ocean is all the drops, and the space between them, and the movement that unites them, and the silent depth that sustains them. This fourth revelation, perhaps more than the three preceding ones, requires time to be digested, because it touches on something that is very close to the heart of most people. The hope that, in extreme moments of life, something from outside the world can intervene to save us. Spinoza was not saying that this hope is foolish. He was saying that it is misdirected. He was saying that the salvation we seek out there is already here, inside, in every moment, as a condition for the very possibility of existence. Looking outward in the hope that God will break the laws to help us is to divert our gaze from where God really is, which is precisely in the laws, in the order, in the silent depth of every moment. And once this fourth door opens, once one truly understands what the permanent miracle of existence is, an inevitable question arises, a question that touches on something even more delicate. Something that is at the center of all Western religious morality, something that may be the oldest, most rooted, most difficult to question notion of all the spiritual heritage we have received, the notion of sin. Because if God is everything, and everything is God, and everything that happens is a direct manifestation of the divine, then what exactly is sin? How can there be evil in a universe that is entirely an expression of God? How can we be guilty for what we do if what we do is part of the unique and infinite fabric of nature? These questions in Spinoza's pen led to a fifth revelation that, even today, is perhaps the most controversial of all. And that will require, before being fully understood, a rare honesty from you and from me. Spinoza had a preferred word in the Latin he wrote to describe the errors of human imagination about the world. That word was superstitio. For him, superstition was not just the belief in curses, in the evil eye, in cursed dates, in Fridays the 13th. Superstition was any belief that projected onto the universe characteristics that belong only to the human mind. And perhaps there is no superstition deeper, more widespread, more ingrained in all human cultures than the traditional notion of sin. You grew up, possibly, hearing about sin, perhaps in a religious family, with sacred books on the bedside table. Perhaps in a secular family, but still using expressions like that is a sin, or he committed a terrible sin. The notion permeates the fabric of our culture so completely that most people never stop to ask what exactly it means. Sin is simply that thing that is known to exist, that is known to be real, and that is known to need to be avoided in order to achieve salvation, or at least peace. Well then, Spinoza, with that geometric patience that was his hallmark, asked exactly that question, what is sin? And the answer he formulated, with the care of a surgeon removing an organ, was so radical that it still unsettles readers who approach it for the first time. Let's take it slow. Because this fifth revelation is the most delicate of all, and any haste can lead to a serious misunderstanding. First, it is important to clarify what Spinoza was not saying. He was not saying that it doesn't matter whether one does good or evil. He was not saying that killing and not killing are equivalent. He was not saying that lying and telling the truth have the same value. He was not saying that helping others and harming others are equally valid. All of this would be a completely wrong reading of his philosophy, and yet many of his contemporaries, and many of his later enemies, read it exactly that way, accusing him of being a destroyer of morality. Spinoza's point was completely different. It was much more subtle, much deeper, and in the end much more demanding than traditional morality. He said first that the popular notion of sin depends on an image of God that he had demolished right in the first revelation. The image of God as a personal judge, sitting somewhere in heaven, observing the acts of men and marking them in a celestial accounting book. Sin, in that image, is any act that displeases that judge. Sin is violating a law established by the personal will of God. Sin is offending divine sensibility and therefore deserving punishment. But, Spinoza said, if God is not a personal being with wills, jealousies, anger, preferences, then this whole structure collapses. God is not watching you from above. God is not marking your acts in a book. God is not offended when you make a mistake, nor rejoicing when you get it right. God is the infinite order of the universe manifesting itself through necessary and eternal laws. Asking God to be offended is like asking the ocean to be angry with a wave. It makes no sense within the very structure of the metaphor. So, Spinoza asked, does this mean that everything is permitted? That there is no difference between good and evil? No, not at all. And here begins the truly beautiful part of the fifth revelation. Spinoza said that there is indeed a real difference between good and evil, but this difference is not founded on the will of a celestial judge. It is founded on something much deeper. It is founded on the very structure of reality. Good is that which increases our power to exist. Evil is that which diminishes it. And both are real. Both have consequences, both matter deeply. But they matter for intrinsic reasons, not for external imposition. Think of a simple example. When you eat something that is spoiled, you get sick. No one needs to punish you for that. The illness is not a divine punishment for your dietary mistake. It is the natural consequence of that act. Similarly, Spinoza said, when you act cruelly towards others, you diminish your own capacity to live well, not because an angry God will punish you at the final judgment, but because cruelty, in itself, corrodes the soul of the one who practices it. Each act of hatred diminishes the hatred in the one who practices it. Each act of lying diminishes the integrity of the liar. Each act of violence hardens the soul of the violent. And conversely, each act of generosity increases the capacity for joy in the one who practices it. Each act of understanding increases inner clarity. Each act of love increases the love in the one who loves, not as an external reward, given from outside by some celestial judge, but as an intrinsic consequence, inseparable from the act itself. This is the point that many critics of Spinoza never understood. By removing the external structure of divine judgment, he was not abolishing ethics, he was deepening it. He was saying that true ethics does not need celestial police. It is inscribed in the very structure of actions. Those who do evil are already being punished by the very evil they do, at the exact moment they do it. Those who do good are already being rewarded by the very good they do, at the exact moment they do it. The rest, the heaven and hell after death, the rewards and punishments in the beyond, were for Spinoza a popular and simplified way of describing a reality that is much more immediate. But Spinoza went even deeper. And here we reach the core of the fifth revelation. He said that most of what we call sin, in popular religious language, is, in fact, a manifestation of ignorance, not of voluntary malice, of ignorance. When a person acts cruelly, Spinoza said, they are almost never doing it by consciously choosing evil. They are doing it because they cannot see at that moment that that act will diminish them. They are confusing what seems good in the short term with what is truly good. They are being dominated by passions that cloud their understanding. They are acting driven by fear, by hatred, by disordered desire, without realizing that these internal states are, in themselves, impoverishing. This view changes everything in the way we judge others, because if Spinoza is right, then the person who acts badly is not, first and foremost, someone who deserves moral punishment. They are, first and foremost, someone who is in a state of ignorance, someone who is not seeing clearly, someone who needs, more than punishment, understanding and, if possible, enlightenment. Spinoza had a phrase in Latin that may be the most famous in all his work. He said, more or less, that we should not laugh at human actions, nor weep before them, nor detest them, but understand them. Non ridere, non lugere, neque detestari, sed intelligere. This phrase summarizes the deepest ethical stance of his philosophy. In the face of evil, Spinoza said, the first task is not to be indignant, it is to understand. Because without understanding, indignation only produces more evil, more hatred, more darkness. But with understanding, the possibility of real transformation opens up. Can you feel the weight of this? If Spinoza is right, then sin, in the traditional sense of the term, does not exist. There is indeed error, ignorance, disordered passion, the act that diminishes the one who practices it. But there is no personal offense to an angry God. There is no eternal stain on the soul. There is no cosmic punishment awaiting in the beyond. All of this, Spinoza said, were images that ancient men, sincere but limited, projected onto the universe from their own mental structures. Useful images at some times to contain human violence, but images nonetheless, not the ultimate truth of things. And here comes a detail that often surprises those who read Spinoza for the first time. Despite all this demolition of the traditional notion of sin, Spinoza was in his personal life an extraordinarily ethical man. He refused inheritances, he refused pensions, he refused university chairs. He lived with so little that more than once his friends had to insist that he accept some help. He was known for his kindness in dealing with neighbors, for his patience with his interlocutors, even those who attacked him violently, for the complete absence of resentment towards the community that had excommunicated him. How can a man who demolished the notion of sin have led such a morally exemplary life? The answer lies precisely in what we are discussing. Spinoza did not live ethically because he feared the punishment of an angry God. He lived ethically because he had understood with deep clarity that each good act enriches the one who practices it, and each bad act impoverishes them. He did not need celestial police. Ethics was in the very fabric of his conscious existence. This is the fifth revelation, perhaps the most difficult to accept, because it deals with very old, very deep, very emotionally charged notions, but once understood, it frees the soul from one of the heaviest prisons that religious tradition created. The prison of eternal guilt, the prison of fear of judgment, the prison of the permanent feeling of being watched by an inflexible judge. And in place of this prison, Spinoza offers something much more serene and much more demanding at the same time. He offers an ethics based on understanding, an ethics that asks you to understand the real consequences of your actions, in yourself and in others, and to act from that understanding, without paralyzing guilt, but also without irresponsible lightness, just with a patient clarity, like that of the philosopher from Amsterdam who, even without fearing an angry God, lived each of his days as if each gesture mattered in a profound and silent way. And, once this fifth revelation is understood, the way opens up for the sixth, a revelation that touches on something even more intimate, something that touches each of us, sooner or later, at some moment in life: death, and what exists or does not exist after it. There is a scene that repeats in silence thousands of times a day in hospitals around the world. Someone holds the hand of a father who is departing, of a mother who is saying goodbye, of a brother, of a friend. And at that moment, even people who throughout their lives said they believe in nothing tend to make, in some corner of their minds, a silent question. Where is he going? What will happen to this consciousness that has been part of my life for so many years? This face, this voice, this unique way of looking at the world, will it simply disappear? Or does it remain somewhere, in some form? Perhaps no human question is older, more universal, more profound than this, and no answer has generated so many religions, so many rituals, so many stories, so many hopes, and so many fears. Spinoza, true to his cold courage, also faced this question, and what he answered in the fifth book of his Ethics is perhaps the most mysterious, most poetic, and most difficult passage of all his work, a passage that philosophers still discuss today without reaching a consensus, a passage that, depending on how it is read, can mean very different things, but that, in any honest reading, is one of the most beautiful attempts that Western philosophy has ever made to answer the enigma of death. Let's take it step by step, carefully. Spinoza begins by rejecting, as one would expect, the two most popular conceptions of the soul and the beyond. The first conception is the one that most religious traditions tend to defend. The soul is an immaterial entity, separate from the body, that during life inhabits this body like a pilot inhabits a vehicle, and that at the moment of death leaves the vehicle and goes alone to its destination, whether it be a heaven of light, a hell of torment, or some intermediate region. This conception, inherited in part from Plato and in part from Semitic religious traditions, became in the West the standard way of thinking about death. Spinoza rejected this conception. And he rejected it for profound philosophical reasons, linked to everything he had built in the previous books of ethics. For him, the human being is not a combination of two substances, one corporeal and one spiritual, that come together temporarily and then separate. The human being is a single thing, viewed from two different angles by our perception. What we call body and what we call mind are, in essence, the same reality. There is no pilot separate from the vehicle. There is a single reality that expresses itself at the same time as body and as mind. The consequence of this view is, at first glance, harsh. If mind and body are the same thing, viewed from different angles, then the destruction of the body should imply the destruction of the mind. And indeed, Spinoza said, without beating around the bush, that what constitutes our personal individuality, our specific memories, our everyday desires, our particular stories, all of this disappears with the death of the body. There is no personal I that continues traveling after death, remembering the people it met, the places it passed through, the joys and sorrows of the life it lived. This personal I is intrinsically linked to the concrete body that existed for some years, and, with the dissolution of that body, that I also dissolves. At first glance, this seems like a classic materialist position. It seems to be saying that death is the absolute end, that after it there is nothing, that the universe simply continues without us as if we had never existed. But it is precisely here, at this delicate point, that Spinoza takes an extraordinary step. A step that few philosophers in history have had the courage or clarity to take. He said, with those mysterious words from the 5th book of Ethics, that something of the human mind remains, not the personal mind, not the specific memories, not the individual history, but something. Something that he called, in Latin, that which is eternal in us, aliquid quod eternum est. What could this eternal something be? Spinoza explains, although the explanation is difficult, he said that, to the extent that our mind, during life, understands things truly, to the extent that it reaches what he called intuitive knowledge, it is participating in the eternal understanding of God. And this participation is not just a metaphor, it is an ontological reality. When you truly understand something, Spinoza said, your mind at that moment is thinking the thought of God. It is not just having a human idea about God, it is, at the deepest level, being a small mode of the infinite understanding of the divine. And that which is a mode of the infinite understanding of God participates in the eternity of God. You need to pause and breathe at this point, because what is being said here is something extremely subtle. Spinoza is not saying that your personal memory will survive death. He is not saying that you will reunite with loved ones in some celestial realm, conversing as you did before. He is not saying any of that. He is saying something that is at once less and infinitely more. He is saying that, to the extent that you participated, during life, in the eternal understanding of the universe, you are eternal, not by the survival of personality, but by participation in the very eternal structure of God. It is as if you were a wave in the ocean. The wave, as a specific wave, with that specific shape, with that specific height, with that specific movement, lasts only an instant. It breaks on the shore, it disappears. But the water that constituted the wave does not disappear. It continues to be ocean. And even more deeply, the very pattern by which that wave existed, the set of physical laws, movements, relationships that produce that specific wave at that specific instant, all of this remains eternally as possibility in the fabric of the world. The specific wave returns to the ocean, but the ocean in some deep sense was already the wave all along. Spinoza said, with those strange and luminous words, that the human mind is, in part, eternal. But this eternity is not a continuation in time. It is a different way of existing outside of time. It is the way your thought, to the extent that it touched the true, to the extent that it understood the deep structure of the real, is an integral part of the deep structure of the real, and therefore participates in its eternity. There is a phrase from Spinoza that may help to feel the weight of this idea. He said that we feel and experience that we are eternal. This phrase has puzzled his commentators, because if eternity were just a continuation in time, no one could experience it in life. But if eternity is a way of existing outside of time, present already now, in every moment we touch the true, then yes, we can experience it. In moments of deep understanding, in moments of true love, in moments of silent contemplation before the greatness of the world. In those instants, Spinoza said, we are touching that which is eternal in us. And this eternity does not wait for us after death. It is here now. It is the structure that supports us while we live. Death is not the door to eternity. A life lived deeply is already the way eternity manifests itself within time. Can you feel how this view is different from the two traditional alternatives? It is not the popular religious view, which speaks of a personal soul that travels to heaven, but it is also not the pure materialist view, which says that death is absolute nothingness. It is a third position, more subtle, more difficult, more mysterious. A position that affirms a form of eternity, but locates it not in the posthumous future, but in the present depth. For Spinoza, then, the question of what happens after death is, in part, poorly formulated. The correct question would be, during life, to what extent did you touch that which is eternal? To what extent did you deeply understand the structure of the real? To what extent did you consciously participate in the divine understanding that sustains the universe? This participation, according to him, is your eternity. Not something that will begin later, something that is happening now, and that will continue to be outside of time, even when your individual body has already dissolved. There is something deeply comforting here, although also deeply demanding. Comforting, because it says that eternity is not a posthumous lottery, dependent on belonging to this or that religion, on having performed this or that ceremony, on having said this or that prayer. Eternity is the deep fabric of those who approach the true, but demanding, because it says that this approach requires real work, real understanding, a life lived with real depth. It is not enough to wait for the end. It is necessary to live with contemplative intensity while one is alive. And here is a detail that may perhaps comfort you if you are now thinking of someone you lost at some moment in life. That person, to the extent that during their passage here they touched the true, to the extent that they loved deeply, to the extent that they understood, to the extent that they participated in the eternal structure of the real, that part of them remains, not as a floating spirit in some celestial realm, but as an eternal mode of divine understanding, and your relationship with that person, to the extent that it was a true relationship, also remains, not as a longing that awaits a future reunion, but as part of the eternal fabric in which you both always existed together, and in which you continue to exist together, outside of time, in the way that God, in Spinoza's view, contemplates himself. It is a strange answer. It does not have the human warmth of the Christian heaven image. It does not have the clarity of the Buddhist reincarnation image, but it has a silent depth, an ontological seriousness, a respect for the complexity of the real that may be, in the end, more comforting than any of the more popular alternatives, because it does not promise what it cannot deliver, and it does deliver something of inestimable value. The awareness that the highest form of existence is already available now, in every conscious gesture of approaching the true. This is the sixth revelation, and it opens the way for the last, the seventh, the highest of all, the revelation that crowns all of Spinoza's philosophy, which he called in Latin amor Dei intellectualis, the intellectual love of God, a form of relationship with the sacred, so different from everything we usually call religion, and at the same time so deeply spiritual that it may be the greatest contribution that this silent thinker from Amsterdam left for humanity. There is a phrase, written in Latin, that may be the most beautiful in all of Baruch Spinoza's work. It appears at the end of the Ethics, after hundreds of pages of geometric demonstrations, rigorous definitions, axioms, propositions, scholia. And when it finally emerges, after all that hard work of reason, it appears like a flower blooming at the end of a long walk through dry lands. The phrase is this: amor Dei intellectualis, the intellectual love of God. These three terms together perhaps form the densest and most luminous expression of Western philosophy. Each word needs to be unfolded carefully, because at first glance they seem to contradict each other. How can love, which we usually associate with the warmth of feeling, be intellectual, linked to the coldness of thought? And how can this love be directed to God, if God, in Spinoza's view, is not a person who can receive affection? The answer to these questions is, in fact, the crown of all Spinoza's philosophy, the seventh revelation, the highest of all, the one in which everything that came before, the six previous revelations, finally comes together in a single luminous vision. Let's take it slow. For Spinoza, the human being is a being that desires. This is the starting point. We do not think first and then desire. We desire first, and then eventually we think about our desires. Desire is the fundamental fabric of human life. It is what moves everything. It is what makes us wake up in the morning, work, love, suffer, fight, create. Spinoza called this fundamental impulse conatus in Latin. It is the effort by which each thing, according to him, perseveres in its being. Each plant, each animal, each human being is, before anything else, an effort to continue existing, to expand, to fully realize what it potentially is. Well then, if we are beings of desire, the fundamental philosophical question becomes, what should we desire to be truly happy? Most people throughout life shift their desire from object to object. They desire in childhood toys, in adolescence acceptance from peers, in youth romances, achievements, status, in maturity money, security, professional recognition, in old age perhaps peace and the presence of those they love. And at each of these stages, they discover that no matter how much they achieve the desired object, the satisfaction lasts little. Soon the desire shifts to another target, and the race continues. Spinoza observed this with the calm coldness that was his hallmark, and concluded that most of human unhappiness comes precisely from this desire displaced to finite objects. Because everything that is finite, sooner or later, slips through our fingers. Loved ones get sick, leave, die. Wealth dissipates, recognition disappears. Bodies age, youth fades. Everything that is finite, by being finite, is under the permanent threat of time. And the human heart, by betting its happiness on finite objects, is betting on a lottery that always, in the end, ends up losing. But, Spinoza said, there is an alternative that few discover, and that those who discover rarely manage to articulate clearly. The alternative is to direct desire, the conatus, the fundamental impulse of being, not towards finite objects, but towards the infinite, towards that which by its very nature cannot escape, towards that which will always be available, towards God. And here it is important to remember who God is for Spinoza, not the personal God of popular religions, not the celestial judge who distributes rewards and punishments, but the infinite substance that manifests as the entire universe, the eternal nature in its ontological depth, the absolute being that expresses itself in every point of reality. To direct desire towards this God, Spinoza said, is not to direct it towards something distant, separate, unattainable. It is to direct it towards the totality of the real. It is to love the universe in its depth. It is to love the eternal structure that sustains all things. It is to love that which, by being everywhere and at all times, will never escape our hands. This is the intellectual love of God. Intellectual because it arises from deep understanding, not from immediate feeling, but intellectual without being cold. Because Spinoza had a fundamental observation about human affects. He said that, as we truly understand something, we feel a deep joy for it. Not a noisy joy, one that fades quickly, but a silent, sustained joy, which increases proportionally to the depth of understanding. When you truly understand an elegant mathematical structure, you feel joy. When you truly understand a complex musical symphony, you feel joy. When you truly understand how a sunset works, with all its physics, with all its chemistry, with all its dynamics of light waves and atmospheric particles, you feel joy. Understanding at a deep level generates joy, and joy, according to Spinoza, is the sign that our power to exist has increased. Now imagine, Spinoza said, the joy that comes from understanding. To the extent that this is possible for a finite mind, the entire structure of the universe, the joy that comes from perceiving the depth of nature, the joy that comes from feeling the direct presence of the divine in everything, in every moment, in every breath. This joy is the intellectual love of God. And this joy, Spinoza said, is the greatest happiness that a human being can achieve. But there is something even more surprising here, something that may seem paradoxical at first glance, but that, once understood, is perhaps the highest point of all his philosophy. Spinoza said that this intellectual love that man has for God is ultimately part of the love that God has for himself. Stop and think about that for a moment. If God is the infinite substance that manifests as the universe, and if the human being, to the extent that it understands, is a mode of God's understanding, then when the human being loves God, it is, at its core, God loving himself through the human being. There is no human subject on one side loving a divine object on the other. There is a single reality in which the divine contemplates, understands, loves itself, through the finite minds that participate in it. This idea has enormous implications. It means that at the moment you truly love the universe, in its ultimate depth, that love is no longer just yours. It is the very way the universe loves itself. You become a channel through which the totality recognizes itself, not as a poetic metaphor, as a precise ontological reality. And there, Spinoza said, is salvation, not in a posthumous heaven, not in a future liberation, but in this very love now at the moment it happens. When a person truly understands and loves the universe in its vastness, they are already living the highest form of existence possible. Nothing is lacking. There is nowhere to go. The peak of spirituality, philosophy, human life is precisely this silent intellectual love which blooms in moments of deep understanding. Imagine someone sitting on a starry night. They are not praying in the traditional sense. They are not asking for anything. They are not begging for celestial favors. They are just looking at the sky with all the possible attention and slowly realizing the immensity of what is before their eyes. They feel without words the vastness of space, the antiquity of light that travels for billions of years to reach their pupils, the profound strangeness of the raw fact that there is something instead of nothing. At some point in this silent contemplation, something within them opens up. A strange joy begins to emerge for no apparent reason, a feeling of belonging, of unity, of immersion in something much greater, and at the same time a feeling of fullness so great that nothing is lacking. That moment, Spinoza said, is the intellectual love of God, and that person, at that instant, is living the highest thing a human being can live. There is something deeply democratic here, and at the same time deeply demanding. Democratic because this experience is not reserved for priests, mystics, initiates of some secret tradition. It is available in principle to any human being capable of thinking and feeling. It does not require specific rituals. It does not require particular religious belonging. It does not require ceremonies. It requires only the ability to pay attention, to understand, and to love. But at the same time, it is demanding, because it requires a long process of deepening. It is not enough to have a fleeting intuition on a special night. It is necessary to cultivate throughout life the ability to understand deeply. It is necessary to study. It is necessary to think. It is necessary to mature. It is necessary to slowly develop the mind's capacity to touch the deep structure of the real. Spinoza, in the last lines of the Ethics, wrote a phrase that became famous among philosophers. He said, more or less, that if the path he had indicated seems very difficult, it can still be found, and that it needs to be difficult because everything that is precious is as rare as it is difficult. These were the final words of his masterpiece, a melancholic acknowledgement that the highest path is not easy, along with a serene affirmation that it exists and is available to those who have the patience to walk it. Here we reach the heart of what Spinoza left us. 7 revelations, which now reveal themselves as 7 steps of a single walk. The first told us that God is everything, and that everything is God. The second showed us that the prophets were translators of imagination, not passive receivers of external messages. The third revealed to us that angels, in the traditional sense, are manifestations of human imagination, and that the direct presence of the divine dispenses with intermediaries. The fourth told us that miracles are not exceptions in the order of nature, but that the entire order of nature is the permanent miracle. The fifth told us that sin, in the traditional sense, is a human projection, and that true ethics is inscribed in the very natural consequences of actions. The sixth told us that something in us is eternal, but that this eternity is not a continuation in time after death, but a way of existing outside of time, present already now, to the extent that we touch the true. And the seventh, finally, tells us that the highest form of human life is the intellectual love of God, the silent joy that comes from understanding and loving the depth of the universe, a joy that is, ultimately, the way the universe itself contemplates itself through us. These are the 7 doors that Spinoza opened. And, when one crosses all of them, one realizes something important. They are not separate doors, they are aspects of a single vision, a vision so vast, so silent, so profoundly different from popular images of the sacred that, For almost 400 years it has been hidden, persecuted, distorted, censored. And at the same time, during those same 400 years, it has been secretly nourishing some of the highest spirits of the West. From Goethe to Einstein, from Hegel to Borges, from Nietzsche to Simone Weil. A silent current that remains alive. It is important for you to know more deeply the life of the man who formulated them, because Spinoza's philosophy cannot be separated from the way he lived. More than perhaps any other thinker in Western history, Spinoza embodied, with his own body, with his own biography, with his own daily choices, what he wrote in his books. And to truly feel the weight of his philosophy, one must know the life of the man behind it. Baruch Spinoza was born in Amsterdam on November 24, 1632. His family was of Sephardic origin, descended from Jews who had been expelled from the Iberian Peninsula in the last decades of the 15th century during the persecution of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition. These Jews, after decades living in hiding as new Christians in Portugal, had finally found refuge in the Netherlands, the only country in Europe at that time that offered a reasonable degree of religious tolerance. The Amsterdam in which Baruch grew up was an extraordinary city. It was perhaps the most cosmopolitan city in the world in the first half of the 17th century. The ports were bustling with goods from all over the globe. The canals reflected the narrow, tall houses of prosperous merchants. In the streets, languages from all corners of the world could be heard. In the cafes, people discussed freely, with an intensity that did not exist in almost any other European capital. And in the Jewish community, in which Baruch was raised, there was an extraordinary intellectual effervescence. Refugees from Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Poland brought with them diverse traditions, rare books, and passionate debates about theology, philosophy, and the interpretation of scriptures. Little Baruch was educated in the community school known as Talmud Torah. He studied Hebrew from childhood. He memorized passages from the scriptures. He learned the fundamentals of the Talmud, medieval commentaries, and classical rabbinic literature. He was considered, by his teachers, an extraordinarily bright child. Some even dreamed that he would become a great rabbi, perhaps one of the most important figures of the new generation of the Sephardic diaspora. But something in Baruch was different. From an early age, alongside traditional studies, he began to take an interest in other readings. In secular philosophy, in mathematics, in science, in languages that were not required by rabbinical training. He learned Latin from a Christian teacher named Franciscus van den Enden, a fascinating man who had left the Society of Jesus to dedicate himself to teaching classical languages and promoting advanced ideas for his time. It was through van den Enden that Baruch came into contact with the writings of Descartes, with classical Roman literature, and with the boldest political ideas of his time. This exposure to a broader intellectual world began to slowly open fissures in the traditional religious edifice in which he had been educated. Not that Baruch became all of a sudden a declared rebel. On the contrary, he was a reserved, calm, studious young man. But within him, silently, ideas began to form. Ideas about the nature of God, about the interpretation of scriptures, about the relationship between reason and faith. Ideas that, if spoken aloud, would certainly put him in conflict with the community. And, unfortunately, these ideas began to leak out. It is not exactly known how. Perhaps Baruch confided some of his reflections to close friends. Perhaps he discussed in small private circles doubts he had about certain points of rabbinical doctrine. The fact is that, in 1654, at the age of 22, he was already seen in the community with growing suspicion. The rabbinical authorities began to watch him. They tried to persuade him to keep his ideas to himself. They offered him, according to some reports, a considerable pension to maintain apparent conformity with the traditional faith, even if he doubted it in silence. Baruch refused, and this refusal at that moment defined the rest of his life. On July 27, 1656, in the Portuguese synagogue of Amsterdam, the most severe cherem in the history of the community was pronounced against him. The document, written in Portuguese, is one of the most impressive texts in Western religious literature. It called for God to curse him day and night. to curse him when lying down and when rising up, to curse him when entering and when leaving, that no one from the community should speak to him, that no one should write to him, that no one should trade with him, that no one should approach him within 4 cubits, that his name should be erased from the community records. Baruch, upon learning of the excommunication, according to the accounts of his early biographers, received the news with surprising calm. It is said that he merely commented that this forced him to do what he would have done anyway, that is, to live according to his convictions, without further need to pretend external conformity. He moved out of the Jewish neighborhood. He changed his name from Baruch in Hebrew to Bento in Latin. The 2 names mean the same, blessed. But the change was symbolically important. It was the mark of a new beginning, of a new identity. No longer a Jew of the Portuguese community of Amsterdam, but a free philosopher with no formal religious affiliation, wholly dedicated to the pursuit of truth. He learned the craft of polishing lenses for microscopes and telescopes. It was a craft of extreme precision, highly valued at a time when science was beginning to explore both the very small and the very large. Over the years, Spinoza became one of the best polishers in Europe. His lenses were sought after by scientists like Christian Huygens, one of the greatest physicists of the time. This work provided him with a modest but sufficient income, and had the additional virtue of allowing him to dedicate most of his day to thought. He moved to a series of small towns outside Amsterdam. He lived in Rijnsburg, in Voorburg, and finally in The Hague. In all these towns, he rented a single room in modest houses of Dutch families, where he spent most of his time. In the morning and afternoon, he polished lenses. At night, he read, wrote, and received visitors interested in discussing philosophy. His reputation slowly began to spread through the intellectual Europe. Letters began to arrive from England, Germany, and France. Philosophers like Henry Oldenburg, Secretary of the Royal Society of London, wrote to him asking for clarifications about his ideas. Leibniz, the great German philosopher, traveled personally to The Hague to meet him and had long conversations with him that he later partially denied in public, fearing the consequences of being associated with the cursed philosopher. At one point in his life, Spinoza received an extraordinary invitation. The University of Heidelberg, one of the most prestigious in Germany, offered him a chair in philosophy. It was a tempting offer. It meant prestige, financial security, institutional recognition. But the offer letter came with a subtle clause. Spinoza would have to, upon taking the chair, commit to not disturbing the officially established public religion. Spinoza declined the offer. His response is one of the most beautiful documents of intellectual freedom in the West. He graciously thanked the invitation. He acknowledged the honor being bestowed upon him. And he explained that, precisely because he wished to continue thinking freely, he could not accept a position that would require him to moderate his thought according to the needs of official religious doctrines. He preferred to continue his modest life as a lens polisher, with all the freedom that this life offered him, rather than take a prestigious chair that would limit his pursuit of truth. This refusal says more about Spinoza than many of his books. It says that he did not seek recognition, fame, or wealth. He sought only one thing, with all the silent passion he was capable of. He sought to understand, and understanding required freedom. And freedom had a price which he was willing to pay until the end. His health deteriorated over the years. The craft of polishing lenses, although intellectually compatible with the philosophical life, was physically harmful. The fine glass dust that was released during work slowly affected his lungs. Spinoza likely had a genetic predisposition to respiratory problems. The combination of the 2 factors led to progressive tuberculosis, which consumed his strength for years. On Sunday, February 21st, 1677, in a small house in The Hague, Bento Spinoza died. He was only 44 years old. He was alone in the room at that moment, with his host having gone out for Mass. When they returned, they found him already departed, sitting quietly in his chair. It is said that a book was open beside him. It is not known which one. His greatest work, the Ethics, had not yet been published. He had worked on it for over 15 years, refining, correcting, demonstrating each proposition with the care of a geometer. He knew that if he published it in his lifetime, he would be imprisoned, or worse. Therefore, he left instructions for it to be published after his death, anonymously, in a collection of posthumous works. It was published a few months later and immediately banned in most of Europe. But despite the prohibitions, it began to circulate in clandestine copies, read in secret by candlelight by an invisible network of spiritual seekers spread across various countries. This is the life of the man behind the 7 revelations, a modest, silent life, exemplarily coherent, a philosopher who lived what he wrote, who paid, with his own existence, the price of what he thought, who refused all shortcuts that could have made him more comfortable in exchange for the only thing he considered truly precious, the freedom to think to the end. And it is precisely because he lived this way that his ideas have traversed the centuries with such force, because, in philosophy, perhaps it is not only the content of ideas that matters. It also matters, and perhaps above all, the coherence between what one thinks and what one lives. Spinoza had this coherence to an extraordinary degree. Therefore, even cursed, even persecuted, even erased from official records, his voice continued to echo in silence, crossing walls and centuries, until it now reaches, at this very moment, your ears. There is something curious that happens when one studies the intellectual history of the West in depth. In almost all the great minds that produced truly original ideas in the last 3 centuries, at some point sooner or later, the shadow of Spinoza appears, sometimes declared with enthusiasm, sometimes mentioned with reverence, sometimes carefully hidden out of fear of social consequences, but there, always there, traversing the centuries like an underground current that feeds the best waters of Western philosophy. Let us begin with Goethe, the greatest German poet of all time. In 1774, Goethe was still a 25-year-old young man, tormented by deep emotional crises, on the brink of an inner collapse. In one of these crises, he found almost by chance a copy of Spinoza's Ethics. He sat down to read, and what transpired in the following days was, according to his own words, one of the most intense spiritual experiences of his life. He later wrote in letters that reading Spinoza had silenced his inner storms, that the serene calm of that philosophy had entered him like a silent light, that, from that moment on, he could never again think of nature in the same way. Goethe would carry Spinoza's influence for the rest of his life, and it appears in the background in almost all of his mature work, both literary and scientific. Hegel, the giant of German philosophy in the early 19th century, was even more direct. He stated in words that became famous that to be a philosopher meant, first and foremost, to be a Spinozist. Not that one should remain a Spinozist forever, but that it was impossible to think deeply without first passing through those pages. For Hegel, Spinoza had placed the fundamental problem of modern philosophy in its purest form, the question of the unity between God and the world, the question of the relationship between the infinite and the finite, the question of how to think about reality without falling into the traps of simplistic dualism. All German philosophy of the 19th century, in a way, was a long conversation with the ghost of Spinoza. Nietzsche discovered Spinoza late in his life. It was in 1881, during his years in Sils Maria, in the Swiss Alps. He had asked a friend to send him some books, and among them came one about Spinoza. Upon reading, Nietzsche had such an intense reaction that he immediately wrote an exalted letter to Franz Overbeck. He said he had found an unexpected precursor, that he recognized himself in the Dutch philosopher in a way he had never experienced before with any other thinker. He listed 5 central points in which he felt deep agreement with Spinoza: the denial of free will, the denial of final causes, the denial of a cosmic moral order, the denial of absolute evil, the denial of disinterested altruism, and he concluded by saying that his philosophical solitude was now at least a solitude of 2. Albert Einstein in the 20th century gave Spinoza one of his most famous declarations. When Rabbi Herbert Goldstein of New York asked him by telegram if he believed in God, Einstein replied also by telegram with a single sentence: the God in whom he believed was the God of Spinoza. That God who reveals himself in the ordered harmony of what exists, that God who does not concern himself with the individual destinies of human beings, but who manifests himself in the profound intelligibility of the universe. This sentence, dictated in a few lines, became a kind of silent creed for countless modern scientists who, without adhering to any traditional religion, still feel a deep reverence for the structure of the world. Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine writer, may have been one of the most moved readers of Spinoza in the 20th century. In several of his poems and essays, he describes the Dutch philosopher polishing lenses in silence on an ordinary afternoon in Amsterdam, while his mind patiently constructs the most perfect system that Western philosophy has known. Borges saw in Spinoza something that resonated deeply with his own sensibility. The idea that the highest intellectual task was to build with patience and precision a mirror of the universe within one's own mind. There are many other names: Schelling, Schleiermacher, Bergson, Russell, even with his reservations, Deleuze, who dedicated to Spinoza some of the most impassioned pages of 20th century French philosophy. Each, in their own way, heard in that silent voice from Amsterdam something that resonated with their own deepest quests. The inevitable question is, why? Why have so many brilliant minds, so different from one another, found in Spinoza an essential companion? Perhaps the answer lies precisely in what we have seen throughout the 7 revelations. Spinoza does not offer a closed doctrine to which one must adhere like a party. He offers a method, a way of thinking, a stance towards the real. And this stance is compatible with the most diverse quests. Those seeking philosophical clarity find in Spinoza a model of rigor. Those seeking deep spirituality find in Spinoza a way of relating to the sacred free from the vices of religious institutions. Those seeking an ethics without authoritarianism find in Spinoza a rational foundation for moral life. Those seeking a non-reductionist scientific worldview find in Spinoza a way to maintain mystery without falling into superstition. Therefore, even cursed and censored for centuries, Spinoza's presence has quietly infiltrated every corner of modern thought. Not as a dominant doctrine, but as a permanent alternative, like that voice that can always be heard on some night of silent reading by those who choose to approach it with sincerity. And this influence remains alive right now at this very moment as you follow this journey. Because by approaching Spinoza's ideas, you are entering a current that spans centuries. You are walking along silently with Goethe, with Einstein, with Borges, with so many others who approached these same pages and were transformed by them. It is a strange and beautiful form of companionship, the silent company of those who, in different times, heard the same voice and were touched by the same light. There was a dimension in Spinoza's work that is often forgotten when only his metaphysics is discussed, a dimension that is deeply political, deeply engaged with the concrete issues of his time, and that at the same time speaks directly to us even today about themes that have not lost a single gram of relevance. Spinoza lived in the Netherlands during an extraordinary moment in European history. The young Dutch Republic had achieved, after a long war against Spain, a political and religious freedom that was absolutely unique in Europe at that time. While France lived under the absolutism of the Sun King, while England went through bloody convulsions between monarchy and parliament, while the German states slowly reassembled from the devastations of the 30 Years' War, the Netherlands was a kind of oasis, a place where Jews expelled from the Iberian Peninsula could live in relative peace, where Protestants and Catholics coexisted, although not without tensions, where banned books in other countries could be printed, where a prosperous merchant class had built a form of republican government that dispensed with absolute kings. But this freedom was under constant threat. The more orthodox Calvinists pressed for the imposition of a strict official religion. Tensions with England and France periodically led to wars that threatened political stability, and in 1672, an episode occurred that deeply marked Spinoza. The brothers Johann and Cornelis de Witt, leaders of the Dutch Republican Party and personal friends of some of the philosopher's friends, were lynched by an enraged mob in The Hague. They were tortured, killed, and their bodies mutilated by the very people they had served as political leaders. Spinoza, upon learning of the massacre, according to his biographers, was overcome by such profound indignation that something within him broke. He prepared a poster with the words, Ultimi Barbarorum, the last of the barbarians, and wanted to go to the site of the massacre to paste it. His host, fearing that the philosopher would become yet another victim of popular fury, locked him in the house to prevent him from leaving. In his despair, Spinoza reportedly struggled to get out. It was one of the rare occasions when the serene calm that was his personal hallmark broke, giving way to overwhelming emotion. This episode shows something important. Spinoza was not a philosopher distant from the concrete issues of his time. He was deeply involved with them, and his political work, especially the theological political treatise and the unfinished political treatise, is one of the most important contributions of Western thought to the theory of freedom. The central thesis of the theological political treatise is simple and revolutionary. The function of the state, Spinoza said, is not to control what people think. It is to protect their capacity to think freely. The state should regulate actions to the extent that those actions affect public life, but it has no legitimate right to regulate consciences, beliefs, or opinions. Attempting to do so is, at the same time, ineffective, because no one can truly control what another person thinks in silence, and tyrannical, because it violates the very essence of the individual's humanity. This idea, written in 1670, is perhaps one of the oldest clear formulations of what centuries later would be called freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and the separation between state and religion. Spinoza was anticipating, with remarkable clarity, some of the fundamental principles of modern democracies, but his argument went deeper than a simple pragmatic defense of tolerance. Spinoza linked this defense to his entire philosophy. As we have seen, the highest form of human life, according to him, is the intellectual love of God. But this love can only flourish where there is freedom to think, where the mind can follow the truth wherever it leads, without being threatened by external authorities, where philosophical and scientific inquiry can proceed without having to bow to official doctrines. Depriving a person of the freedom to think is, for Spinoza, to deprive them of the very possibility of achieving what is highest in human life. And he observed something even more subtle. States that attempt to control consciences generally fail, but in the process, they produce a society of hypocrites, people who say in public what the authorities want to hear, but who think the opposite in secret. This chasm between public discourse and private conscience corrodes the moral integrity of an entire society. It creates divided, sick citizens incapable of living with wholeness, and paradoxically, it prepares the ground for much greater explosions of violence than those that were intended to be avoided with the control of ideas. The solution, according to Spinoza, is radically different. Allow each person to think freely, in peace, without fear. Trust that, in the long run, truth has more strength than lies, and that freedom generally generates more stability than repression. This serene trust in human reason is one of the most beautiful characteristics of Spinoza's thought. At a time when most governments viewed freedom as a threat to order, Spinoza saw freedom as the most solid foundation for any lasting order. Today, centuries later, we live in societies that have adopted, at least in principle, many of Spinoza's ideals. The modern constitutions of liberal democracies enshrine freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and the separation between state and religion. Spinoza was one of the pioneers of these principles, but vigilance never ends. In all times, in all countries, there are always forces that try to impose restrictions on thought, on speech, on conscience. Therefore, reading Spinoza today is not just an exercise in history, it is also a living reminder that these freedoms were won with effort, that they must be defended with vigilance, and that their loss means the loss of what is highest in human possibility. Who was Spinoza in his daily life? What was the concrete texture of his days like? What faces did he see? What conversations did he have? What silences did he inhabit? Knowing these small everyday dimensions may be the most intimate way to approach a thinker. Because philosophy, in the end, is not just a set of propositions written in books. It is also, and perhaps above all, a way of living, and few philosophers lived their philosophy as fully as Spinoza. Contemporary accounts paint a consistent picture. Spinoza was a man of medium height, thin, with dark curly hair, deep-set eyes, and a generally serene expression. He dressed simply, but with care. He did not wear the tattered clothes of hermits, nor the elegant garments of prosperous burghers. He wore dignified, modest clothing, always clean. When asked why he cared about his appearance even while living with so little, he replied that the outer form reflects the respect one has for oneself and for others. He woke up early. He worked in a lens polishing workshop for much of the day. The work required extreme concentration. It was necessary to polish concave and convex lenses with precise curvatures, according to specifications provided by the scientists who ordered them. Spinoza did this with meditative patience. The repetitive, slow, careful movement was perhaps part of what sustained the contemplative rhythm of his intellectual life. Some say that polishing lenses was, for him, a form of prolonged meditation. His hands did the precise work. His mind, freed from urgency, could wander through the territories of thought. He ate little. Accounts say that often his lunch was just a soup of milk with butter and some raisins. He drank beer in moderation, as was the Dutch custom. He did not care for culinary luxuries. His relationship with his body was one of serene care, without exaggerated ascetic rigor, but also without any indulgence. He took care of himself, as one cares for an instrument that needs to function well in order to do the most important work. He received visitors frequently. His reputation as a wise man, despite ecclesiastical prohibitions, had spread throughout the intellectual Europe. Students, philosophers, scientists, and doctors traveled to the house where he was staying to talk with him. Spinoza welcomed everyone courteously, but with an economy of time. He would converse for a few hours, but then return to work. He was not a host who prolonged dinners for entire nights. His life had its own rhythm, and he respected it with serene firmness. One of the most touching details in accounts about Spinoza relates to his relationship with the landlady who took care of him in his last years in The Hague. She was a simple woman, the wife of a painter named Hendrik van der Speyk. She and Spinoza got along well. He was interested in the practical life of the family, in the couple's small children, in the little details of everyday life. When Mrs. van der Speyk once asked him if her religion, Lutheranism, was sufficient for salvation, Spinoza replied with his characteristic serenity. He told her that her religion was good and that she did not need to seek another. It was enough that she lived simply, took care of her family, and was honest in her dealings with others. This, Spinoza said, was already the essence of true spirituality. This small episode says a lot about the philosopher. Spinoza, despite all his radical criticisms of institutional religions, did not try to demolish the faith of ordinary people. He recognized that for most people, traditional religions served a useful function, teaching basic ethical principles, offering comfort in difficulties, providing a sense of community. What he criticized was the use of religion as an instrument of power, as a justification for persecution, as an obstacle to free thought. But the sincere faith of a simple person, lived with integrity, was not his enemy. On the contrary, it was something he respected. Spinoza was also extraordinarily generous. There are several accounts of small everyday acts that show this silent generosity. When he discovered that his father had died and that his sister, along with her husband, was trying to exclude him from the family inheritance, Spinoza took the matter to court. He won the case, but after winning he gave up almost the entire inheritance in favor of his sister, keeping only a bed. What he wanted was not the money. It was merely the confirmation of the principle of justice. Once the principle was confirmed, he could give everything else away, because for him, material goods were secondary. When a friend, Simon Justin de Vries, close to death and without children, wanted to leave him as heir to a considerable fortune, Spinoza refused. He convinced his friend to leave the inheritance to his brother, who would have more need. He accepted only a small annual pension, and even that he later reduced by half, saying it was more than he needed to live. These stories accumulate and paint the portrait of a man who lived in a rare harmony between his ideas and his actions. The philosophy he wrote in books, about the liberation from disordered desires, about a life governed by calm reason, about the intellectual love that sees in everything the manifestation of the divine, was not for him an abstract theory. It was the concrete structure of his daily life. Each small gesture seemed to confirm the larger propositions he demonstrated in his geometric pages. And perhaps this is the most powerful testimony Spinoza left us. Not the books, no matter how brilliant they are, but the life he lived while writing those books, a life that discreetly shows that what he thought was possible to be lived, that the intellectual love of God was not a philosopher's fantasy, but a real way of existing, that serenity in the face of the world's storms was a possible achievement for those who approached their own philosophy with honesty. It may seem that everything we have seen so far belongs to a distant past, 17th century Amsterdam, lens polishers with tuberculosis, theological controversies that seem alien to the hurried world we live in. But if we look closely, we will discover that Spinoza's 7 revelations have immediate, surprisingly practical applications in the daily life of an ordinary human being in the 21st century. Let us begin with the first revelation. God is everything, and everything is God. How can this touch your life now, at this very moment? In a very concrete way. It means that you do not need to seek the sacred somewhere distant. You do not need to wait for the next spiritual retreat, the next trip to a holy place, the next extraordinary moment. The sacred is here, in the cup of coffee you drink in the morning, in the light that enters through the window, in the voice of the one you love when he or she calls you from another room, in the very fatigue you feel at the end of a long day. All of this, in Spinoza's view, is a direct manifestation of the divine. And this perception, when it settles in, transforms the texture of everyday experience. Life ceases to be a succession of mundane moments with some special moments scattered here and there. It becomes a single prolonged sacred moment in which each instant carries the same depth. Practical application. Try for a few days to pay a little more attention to common things. Not too much, not demanding. Just a little more. Look at the glass of water before drinking. Feel its weight in your hand. The texture of the surface, the clarity of the water. This, according to Spinoza, is God. Look at the face of a loved one, not in a hurry, with seeing eyes. Each line of the face is a manifestation of the infinite. Do this for a few days and see how your relationship with the ordinary begins to change. Second revelation. The prophets were translators of the imagination. How does this help you today? In a very interesting way, it helps you develop a healthy, critical stance towards anyone who claims to speak in the name of God. Throughout the ages, there have been those who try to impose their personal authority by claiming to have received privileged divine messages. Spinoza's analysis gives us a tool to examine these claims calmly, without contempt, without fanaticism, but without naivety. Always ask, does the content of what is being said make sense on its own merits? Is it morally profound? Is it rationally coherent? Does it enhance the life of those who hear it or diminish it? If it enhances, it is worthy of attention, even if it comes wrapped in dramatic language. If it diminishes, no claim of special revelation should convince us. Third revelation. Angels as manifestations of the imagination. Practical application. When you feel, in difficult moments, that presence of protection that many call an angelic presence, accept it with gratitude. But know that this presence does not come from outside. It does not come from some separate celestial realm. It is the direct presence of the divine within you, manifesting itself with particular intensity at that moment. You do not need intermediaries to access the sacred. It has been within you all along. Angels, in the deepest sense, are the ways in which the divine becomes sensitive to your own mind. Fourth revelation. Miracles are not exceptions, but the totality of existence is the permanent miracle. Practical application. Stop waiting for special moments to feel gratitude. Gratitude, from a Spinozist perspective, is the natural state of those who realize that each breath is, in itself, an extraordinary event. Start the day, if you can, with a pause of a few seconds to perceive the raw fact that you exist, that there is something instead of nothing, that your body is functioning at this moment without you having to consciously organize the billions of chemical operations that sustain your life. This is the permanent miracle. Spinoza said that those who perceive this no longer need any other miracle. Fifth revelation. Sin, in the traditional sense, does not exist. Practical application. Free yourself from paralyzing guilt. To err is not to offend a celestial judge. To err is to diminish one's own power to exist, and that is punishment enough in itself. But, equally, to err does not require continuous self-flagellation. It requires understanding. What does that error teach me about the real consequences of my actions? How can I, from this understanding, act differently next time? This posture, without guilt but also without levity, is perhaps one of Spinoza's most practical contributions to contemporary psychological health. Sixth revelation. Eternity is here now, to the extent that we touch the true. Practical application. Do not postpone life. Do not live waiting for heaven. Do not live waiting for retirement. Do not live waiting for the day when everything will be resolved. Deepen the now. Every time you truly understand something, you are participating in eternity. Every time you truly love, you are participating in eternity. Every time you deeply contemplate the beauty of the world, you are participating in eternity. Eternity is not a distant future. It is a present depth that grows with your attention. Seventh revelation. The intellectual love of God as supreme happiness. Practical application. Cultivate intellectual curiosity throughout your entire life. Study, read, think. Approach the various dimensions of reality with a hunger to understand. Each deep knowledge you acquire is, in Spinoza's view, a small participation in the eternal understanding of the divine. And this participation generates a quiet, sustained joy, different from the noisy and fleeting joys that the world tries to sell us all the time. Those who adopt Spinoza as a master never age intellectually. They may age in body, but the mind continues to deepen until the last day. These applications are not self-help tricks. They are not magical techniques to solve problems. They are a slow, patient, profound transformation of how you relate to your existence. But precisely because they are profound, they have real effects. People who seriously approach Spinoza's philosophy report, over the years, subtle but significant changes. More serenity in the face of adversity, more joy in small things, less fear of death, less dependence on the approval of others, more clarity in decisions, a general sense of being more whole, more present, more real. And these changes, in the end, are perhaps the best testimony that Spinoza's philosophy is not a historical curiosity. It is a living path that remains available now for anyone who has the courage to walk it. An elementary intellectual honesty requires that we also present the main arguments that have been raised against Spinoza over the centuries, because no philosophical system is immune to criticism. And mature thought is not one that blindly accepts a doctrine, but one that, after examining both its strengths and its difficulties, decides whether it is worth adopting, even with reservations. The first major objection relates to the idea of God as nature. Religious critics have always said that this identification empties God of his personality, and in doing so, empties the human relationship with the sacred of everything that makes it meaningful. How to pray to an impersonal nature, how to love that which cannot love back, how to have a true relationship with something that is merely ontological structure, and not a conscious presence that cares for me. Spinoza's defenders respond with a subtle observation. They say that the idea of a personal God, who is concerned with the individual destinies of human beings, is ultimately an anthropomorphic projection. It is to attribute human characteristics to God that, upon reflection, do not make sense in an infinite reality. A God who is specifically concerned with me, and not with other forms of life in the universe, is a God who has favorites. And having favorites is a characteristic of limited beings, not of an infinite reality. Spinoza, they say, does not empty God of greatness. On the contrary, he liberates God from the anthropomorphic limitations that human imagination has imposed on him for centuries. The second major objection is ethical. If everything that happens is a direct manifestation of the divine, then how can we morally condemn anything? If violence, cruelty, and injustice are also part of the unique fabric of nature, then how can we say they must be fought? Wouldn't we, in combating them, be fighting against God himself? Spinoza answers this objection in a way that at first glance seems complex, but which has profound elegance. He said that yes, everything that happens is a manifestation of divine nature. But within that nature, there are manifestations that enhance life and manifestations that diminish it. Human beings, as finite modes of nature, have the fundamental impulse to persevere in their being, to increase their power to exist. Therefore, it is natural and rational to combat what diminishes them and to support what enhances them. Fighting violence is not fighting against God. It is, on the contrary, acting in accordance with the deeper structure of divine nature itself, which expresses itself in each finite mode as an effort for self-realization. The third major objection is psychological. Critics say that Spinoza's philosophy is cold, that it offers, instead of a living religion, a mathematical, distant God who cannot be loved like a father, who cannot be invoked in moments of distress, who cannot offer the emotional comfort that the human soul deeply needs in its dark hours. Defenders respond that this perception of coldness is superficial. Those who have read Spinoza deeply realize that his philosophy is, in fact, profoundly passionate. The intellectual love of God, described at the end of the Ethics, is one of the most intense forms of affection that philosophical literature has ever described. It is not coldness. It is a different kind of warmth, a warmth that does not come from dramatic images, but from the serene contemplation of the real. And many people, after a serious engagement with Spinoza, describe the comfort that this philosophy offers as ultimately deeper than that of traditional religions, because it does not depend on promises that may not be fulfilled. It depends only on the present reality, which is always available. The fourth major objection is that of determinism. Spinoza was a determinist. He believed that everything that happens necessarily according to the eternal laws of divine nature. There is no free will in the traditional sense in his philosophy. Critics say that this destroys moral responsibility. If I cannot choose freely, how can I be held accountable for my actions? Spinoza responds that moral responsibility does not depend on metaphysical free will. It depends on the capacity of a person to be affected by arguments, by understandings, by changes in perspective. Even in a deterministic universe, rational argument is one of the causes that determine behavior. Therefore, it makes sense to educate, it makes sense to punish when necessary, it makes sense to praise when deserved. These practices do not presuppose absolute free will. They only presuppose that human beings are influenced by reasons, and that is enough to support a serious ethics. There are other objections, more technical, more specialized, that professional philosophers discuss among themselves. But these four are the main ones, and, as we have seen, Spinoza has answers for each of them. Answers that do not convince all of his critics, of course, but that show that his philosophy is a robust system, capable of sustaining critical dialogue over the centuries, without collapsing. In the end, each person must decide, with personal honesty, whether Spinoza's answers to the objections are satisfactory. There is no definitive verdict to offer here. What can be said is that among all the great philosophical systems in Western history, Spinoza's is among those that have best withstood the test of time. It remains alive. It continues to be discussed. It continues to offer answers to questions that other systems ignore. And this, in philosophy, is a sign of depth. We have reached the end of this long journey. 7 philosophical revelations, the life of Baruch Spinoza, his influence on the greatest geniuses of the West, his deeply contemporary political dimension, his serene daily life, the practical applications of his ideas, the main objections and their answers. All of this has paraded before your eyes, or rather your ears, throughout this journey that began on a night in Amsterdam nearly 400 years ago, and ends here now at this very moment in your mind. What remains? Perhaps this is the most important question, not what we learned, in an informative sense, but what from this journey remains in some transformative way within us. Spinoza, upon finishing the Ethics, wrote a famous phrase. He said that the path he pointed out was difficult, but it existed, and that it had to be difficult, because everything that is precious is as rare as it is difficult. This phrase is perhaps the best synthesis of his legacy. It is not a promise of easy solutions. It is not a comfortable religion. It is not a hurried self-help. It is a demanding, long, patient path, but it is a real path. And those who walk it find in the end something that few things in this world can offer. What one finds is a form of peace that does not depend on circumstances, not the superficial peace of those who avoid problems, but the deep peace of those who have learned to look at everything that exists, including suffering, with the serenity of one who perceives that each thing is part of an infinite and ordered totality. It is not passive resignation, it is active lucidity. It is the ability to continue acting, continue loving, continue building, even knowing that everything one does is finite, even knowing that every person one loves will one day depart, even knowing that our own body, sooner or later, will return to the eternal fabric of nature. This peace is the gift that Spinoza left us, and it is available not in a distant future, not in some celestial region, not in some afterlife. It is available here now to the extent that each of us has the courage and patience to approach it. Think of everything we have traversed. We saw a man who lost the community that had formed him, who survived assassination attempts, who refused prestigious chairs to preserve the freedom to think, who lived modestly and quietly in small rented rooms, who polished lenses to sustain a life dedicated to philosophy, who died young, never seeing the recognition that his work would eventually have. And yet, amidst this outwardly difficult life, he achieved something that very few human beings achieve, a deep serenity that transcended all his adversities, a way of existing that was, itself, the living demonstration of his philosophy. This is perhaps the most moving testimony that Spinoza left us, the testimony that the good life, in the deepest sense of the term, is possible. Not an easy life, not a life full of external achievements, but a truly human life, lived with wholeness, with depth, with real connection to what is highest in human possibility. And now, at the end of this long journey, what remains is a choice. Each person, after hearing this story, will do something with it. Some will simply forget. Others will keep it as an interesting curiosity. But some, perhaps, will feel that something has stirred within, that something has opened, that a new way of looking at the world has insinuated itself almost imperceptibly into consciousness. For these, the journey does not end here. It only ends the introductory part. The rest of the journey will be traveled by each one, at their own pace, over the years to come. Perhaps you will start looking for Spinoza's books. Perhaps you will delve into commentators. Perhaps you will attend joint readings in study groups. Perhaps you will simply, in silence, let these ideas work within you, slowly, over time, transforming your perception of the everyday. Whatever the path, it will be yours. And that is exactly how Spinoza wanted it to be. He never wanted servile disciples. He wanted free seekers, people who, after approaching his ideas, would continue walking on their own legs towards their own understanding. There is a phrase at the end of the theological political treatise that may serve as an appropriate farewell. Spinoza said that peace is not the absence of war, that peace is a virtue, a disposition of the soul, a way of existing. Peace, as the absence of war, is merely the anteroom of true peace. True peace is the active serenity of one who lives in harmony with the deep structure of the real. This peace is what he wished for his readers. This peace is what I wish for you now, at the end of this journey. A man was born in 1632, in a cold city in northern Europe. He lived 44 years. He was excommunicated by his community. He was censured by churches. He was prohibited by kings. He was almost murdered by fanatics. He died poor, in a small rented room without family, without official honors. And yet this man left humanity one of the greatest gifts that a thinker can leave. A different way of looking at God, a different way of looking at the universe, a different way of looking at oneself, a different, higher and brighter way of living. His name was Baruch Spinoza, Benedict in Latin, blessed in Portuguese, and perhaps in the end this name says it all, because a man who lived as he lived, and thought as he thought and loved as he loved, was, in the deepest sense of the term, blessed. Not by a distant God looking down from above, but by the very infinite reality in which he was immersed, and which, through him, reached one of its most beautiful self-understandings. May your peace, reader of this long journey, be his peace, not as a copy, but as a resonance, each one living their own version of the same deep silence, each one discovering at their own pace that the sacred was never far away, that it has always been here, in every breath, in every thought, in every heartbeat now. Good journey.